Okay, so in this video lecture, I want to finish off the Republic. It sounds really terrible, but that's where we're going to get to. I realize this week of the course has included a lot of details, a lot of people, but we're almost through it, and this sordid tale of the last century of the Republic will come to its conclusion. And we'll be able to move on from the kind of intense politics of this period to other topics when we discuss the empire over the next couple of weeks. So when Julius Caesar was victorious over Pompey in the east and sort of spent a couple of years mopping up the last pockets, well, it wasn't the last pockets of resistance, but most of the pockets of resistance in the east and in North Africa. Cato was dead, and others who had opposed Caesar were gone. But the one thing that we should note about Caesar, which was perhaps to his credit, but also was an important source of his downfall, was that he tended to be magnanimous. He tried very hard not to be Sulla. He did not carry out massive proscriptions against his rival senators, including the hundreds who joined with Pompey in the east, and so figures like Cicero and Marcus Junius Brutus, who was the son of Caesar's most important mistress. Caesar did have a lot of paramours, a lot of mistresses, including several wives of prominent senators. He was quite a ladies' man, quite a seducer, but his his greatest flame, as it were, was the Servilia, the mother of Marcus Junius Brutus, and Brutus, of course, is going to be one of the ringleaders of the conspiracy to assassinate him, and so he forgave Brutus, he forgave Gaius Cassius Longinus, who would become the other ringleader of the conspiracy to kill him. And that meant that the Senate continued to operate, and the magistrates continued to be chosen, but Caesar was the one calling all the shots. In fact, in the year 44, he just went ahead and extended the dictatorship for life, and the Senate could really do nothing to oppose him in this. Why did he do that? Well, he recognized that the dictatorship was the source of his power, and that if he were to give that up without seeing this through for at least a very long time, I mean, who knows whether he would have laid it down eventually once he felt that his work was done, but if he wanted to stay in power, he couldn't continue to rely on the whims of being elected consul and things like this. In Caesar's mind, the only option was to continue to be dictator. But this may have been the thing above all other things that alienated these senators who felt that he was transforming the empire into a monarchy, which of course the Romans loathed, and the lessons of which they had absorbed from the earliest days of the Republic, the overthrow of the monarchy, and the establishment of the Republic, right? They continued to think about stories like the rape of Lucretia and all of that. That was resonant with them at this time, and that's one of the things that inspired the conspirators. In the couple of years that Caesar was back in Rome acting as dictator, in fact, it wasn't even a couple of years, it's about a year, he did do a few transformative things. The most important of these probably was his restocking of the Senate. Not that a lot of senators had been killed, but some fairly prominent ones had. Caesar decided that in order to create a body that was largely loyal to him, that he needed to add to its ranks, and so he increased the size of the Senate to about 900, ballooning it from what it had been traditionally. Most of the new senators came from the ranks of the equites, but a few of them were provincials, meaning curiales, elites from the different provinces, many of whom were now sworn to Caesar. And so, he was trying to reshape this into a body that he could control entirely, perhaps not even with the dictatorship. He also pulled off some calendar reform. The Senate rewarded him for his great deeds by renaming the month of July after him, which is why we have that name still. In most of the European languages, we do rely on the Roman calendar, and he was the first to change this from a calendar that was primarily lunar with some kind of additional months occasionally that would match it up with the cycles of the season with the solar calendar. He went ahead and installed a solar calendar of 365 and a quarter days, which is basically the calendar that we still use today with a few modifications that were done in the Middle Ages. He has a lot of veterans, of course, of his many wars, and so he opened up colonization again, especially in places like Carthage and Corinth, which had been destroyed by the Romans and rebuilt as colonies. This was, of course, popular among the veterans, but drew the ire, or at least the disapproval of some of the senators and equites and others, but they could do little about it, given that he was dictator. And he also, as later on Octavian or Augustus would do, and many emperors to come after him would do, he provided jobs for people by huge building projects, adding new aqueducts, building new temples, bridges, roads, things like this in Rome and outside of Rome. And so, he made himself a champion of the poor by providing jobs, while at the same time he did cut the size of the grain dole more than in half, right? And so where one hand gives, the other one takes away, so to speak. That's kind of what Caesar was trying to do to maintain his popularity. After a year or so in Rome, Caesar was just about to leave. He had a plan to go back to the east and invade Parthia, to attempt to do what Crassus had failed to do. And this is indicative, I think, of, Caesar's interests, his personality, that he perhaps missed the simplicity of the military campaign where things were pretty straightforward, as opposed to the drudgery of, trying to handle politics in Rome with all of its complications, with its bureaucratic headaches and things like this. So Caesar was about to go back to the east, and he gave his will to the Vestal Virgins. In that will, which was common among the elite Romans, sort of for safekeeping in the city hearth. And in that will, he gave most of his fortune and to his great nephew, Octavian, who was kind of a sure-tail relative, to be honest. But it seems that Caesar had been very impressed by the character of Octavian, that he had already shown a political savvy that would, of course, do him very well eventually. And he adopted, in this will, he adopted Octavian as his son, which was quite common, as I think we've said before, but for elite Romans to do, especially in trying to establish the next paterfamilias of the familia. And so he provided this will. He was making plans to leave, to go back to Parthia. And the senators who had entered into a conspiracy to get rid of Caesar realized that they had few chances left, and so they made a plan for the Ides of March, that is March 15th, 44 BCE, where they assassinated him during a meeting of the Senate. And this is made most famous by Shakespeare, but the truth of it was that, Shakespeare knew the sources, actually, and did a passable job, I think, capturing what happened that day. Who were the conspirators? Many of them, maybe most of them, were senators who had joined Pompey during the Civil War between them, and had been forgiven by Caesar and installed in their in high offices, so that by Caesar's plan, of course, they would become dependent on him, right? That they would see his magnanimity and not be able to speak out against him, and this would effectively neutralize them as rivals. It did not neutralize them as rivals. This was a massive miscalculation on Caesar's part. The ringleaders of this conspiracy were, as I've said, Marcus Junius Brutus, who was the son of Caesar's most prominent paramour, and Servilia, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, who was also a kind of elite senator who had disapproved of Caesar and had tried to join with Pompey. There were even a couple of kind of disenchanted Caesarians who joined with this conspiracy. Decimus Brutus being the most prominent one, who was, I believe, a cousin, if I'm not mistaken, of Marcus Brutus. He had been a supporter of Caesar, but seemed to have grown disenchanted with him. Notably, the conspirators did not include Cicero, who probably would have objected on principle and maybe, given his flair for rhetoric, have outed the conspirators to try to gain something of his own. They did not include Cicero in these plans. Why did they do this? Well, I mean, this is where the sources can be quite biased. Marcus Brutus tended to be admired by ancient sources who saw Caesar's establishment of the dictatorship for life as a forerunner of the empire, and longed for the good old days of the Republic. Those visions of the Republic were probably a little too romantic. These are, authors like Cassius Dio and Suetonius was more just a gossip, but Dio Cassius and Tacitus and some others. Sallust was a fairly pro-Caesar kind of guy, but some of these others, writing a bit later, longed for the Republic, even if it was just a romantic vision of what they thought the Republic had been. And they saw Brutus as this great Roman who was just trying to defend the Republic, the traditional structures of the Republic, against this guy who was hell-bent on creating a monarchy. Was Caesar trying to create a monarchy? Well, that's another source of debate among historians. In reading the Edward Watts book, you'll see that he talks about this at some length, mentioning that Caesar had floated the plan to some of his confidants, it seems, to possibly just declare himself king. But it's uncertain whether that happened or not, right? The important thing is Caesar was killed, right? Stabbed 23 times. Apparently only one of these wounds was actually fatal. It seems that some of them were quite hesitant at this. Who made the killing blow? Was it Brutus? Was it Cassius? Was it somebody else? It's uncertain, I believe. But Caesar's dead, okay? And this touched off a dizzying sequence of events that I am not going to go into all of the details about here. Suffice it to say that there were a lot of miscalculations in this. Brutus and Cassius seem to have thought that, particularly Brutus seems to have been guilty here, have thought that everyone would welcome this, that they were just waiting for the tyrant to be killed. Like many kind of out-of-touch senators throughout Roman history, Brutus seems not to have thought about the opinions of the Roman public, that he was thinking primarily about the Senate, and that was all that really counted, that the public was fickle and they could easily be won over, that they would see the wisdom in killing off Caesar. They hadn't considered his great popularity among the masses, which he had continued to court, during his time as the dictator. Nor did they spread the circle of assassination beyond Caesar, and this was another massive miscalculation. Had they taken out some of Caesar's strongest supporters, including Marcus Antonius, including perhaps Lepidus, and possibly even, Octavian was on no one's radar at this point. He was merely the heir, and the will was still somewhat secret at this point. And it seems that Brutus did not have a taste for bloodshed. He really didn't want to kill Antony, extend the murder here. He simply wanted this to be Caesar, and then make a statement that, of what a great thing this was, that the dictator was gone. And initially, Brutus and Cassius then reached out to Antony and Lepidus and others, and tried to get them to say, or tried to explain to them why they had done this, and get them to see the wisdom in it. And it seems that Antony initially made nice with them. This is certainly how Shakespeare tells it, but the ancient sources indicate this as well. But then at the funeral of Caesar, now let me remark on that. In the aftermath of this, the Senate made a few decisions. One of these was to, in order to kind of win over Caesar's troops, who would have been his strongest supporters, they ratified all the decisions that Caesar had made relative to them. That is, that they were going to provide them lands and pensions, and sort of ratify all of the conquests that Caesar had made, and the decisions that he had made militarily, right? Because otherwise the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers that Caesar commanded almost certainly would have made their lives very difficult, right? But seizing the opportunity, Marcus Antonius, who we'll simply call Mark Antony at this point, that's the anglicized version of his name, Antony, at the funeral of Caesar, made a brilliant speech. He doesn't seem to have been a fantastic orator, but he did have a pretty good political sense, and he didn't have to say much of his own composition. He mostly just read out the will of Caesar, which included not only the adoption of Octavian and the passing of most of Caesar's inheritance to Octavian, although Caesar, sort of interestingly in the will, gave a fair amount of the inheritance to some of the people who participated in the conspiracy to kill him, which may have been a calculation on Antony's part that they would look just disingenuous here, right? That Caesar was magnanimous even to them, and they killed him anyway. And Antony was using this as a moment to really seize control of the situation and to establish himself as the heir to Caesar, at least the heir to his political fortunes. Moreover, Caesar had left a fair amount of money, and even more importantly, perhaps, a bunch of land to the public. And given that Rome was this teeming, probably fairly filthy city, Caesar's gardens, which was this is a significant piece of property in the heart of Rome, he declared would become a public park, and that was something that Romans of all sort of classes appreciated. And Caesar came off as just this great father figure, magnanimous, generous, right? And the public was incensed against the conspirators. And this gave Antony the upper hand. Now, the conspirators did not initially leave Rome. They sort of sat there with their mouths agape going, how did we lose control of this situation? They tried to meet with Antony and Lepidus. And in fact, Antony and Lepidus initially agreed with them. Antony and Lepidus dined with Cassius and Brutus on one occasion, and they agreed to kind of work together to smooth over the situation. But then, as soon as they were out of the company, Antony was immediately trying to inflame the passions of the Roman public. And this led to several things. First of all, Cassius and Brutus and some of the other conspirators ended up having to leave Rome for their own safety. Cassius and Brutus went off to the east and began to extort money and try to raise armies, seeing that they were almost certainly going to have to fight for their lives. Decimus Brutus went up to Gaul and tried to kind of seize that situation. But Antony used this to push through, because he was actually consul that year in 44, to push through a really nice proconsular position for him in Gaul, actually in Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, meaning the place that Caesar had been governor over. And he left and went to Gaul. And at this point, Cicero, feeling like he could control things, Cassius and Brutus were removed from the situation, Cicero then gave a series of speeches decrying the actions of Antony, claiming that he was trying to set himself up as the next tyrant or the next autocrat, that he was intending to seize control of the Republic and establish himself as dictator, and we would be back to square one where we've been with Caesar. And Cicero, who was very good, of course, at rhetoric, gave some of the most passionate speeches of his entire life. These are known as the Philippics against Antony. Philippic in the sense that he was imitating the great Athenian orator Demosthenes, who gave these speeches against Philip of Macedon. And Antony heard about this and essentially said, Cicero's got to go, right? In the meantime, Octavian emerges for the first time. Now, Octavian was, at this point, only 18 years old. And everyone, Antony, Lepidus, Cicero, Cassius Brutus, all of them, saw him as a non-factor in this. Even though he had been given the lion's share of the inheritance of Caesar, no one really feared Octavian. They thought they could easily control him. But Octavian, with the... and actually, Octavian manipulated the situation extremely well. This is one of the things that Watts goes into in a lot of detail in his book. But, he tried to have the will ratified by the Senate, including the adoption provision, and Antony blocked it. And this made Antony look disingenuous, right? That he was trying... and the reason Antony did it is he wanted to be the heir of Caesar, not the kind of property heir, but the political heir. And this happened repeatedly. And Octavian began to use his own resources, some of which he had kind of seized control of in the aftermath of the assassination, to hire mercenaries who would form the core of a client army for him. And he also appealed to the Senate once Antony had left, and they saw him as a tool they could use, and so they bestowed upon him senatorial rank, and sent him, along with the two consuls in that year, and this is, I believe, the year 43, against Antony. And so, Octavian took his own now private army up to aid the consuls. And Octavian was quite successful in this military campaign against Antony. The consuls both, and these were loyal Caesarians, they both were, killed in these battles against Antony. And Octavian ended up fighting on his own against Antony's forces and winning several battles against him and really kind of marginalizing Antony to the point that he, it looked like he was about to be finished off. And given this, Cassius Brutus and especially Cicero began to rejoice, thinking that they had triumphed, thinking that Antony's appeal or Antony's ploy to gain the position that Caesar had failed. And in response to this, they made a colossal mistake. I mean, looking at this in hindsight, this is really the last moment where the senators could have perhaps seized control of the situation for good. They awarded, they did a few things. They celebrated the victory over Antony. They awarded the legions that Octavian now controlled. They gave them military awards and things like this, but they did not extend any awards to Octavian as their commander. In fact, they snubbed him entirely. And then they decreed that these legions would be transferred to other people. They didn't give Octavian the chance. They didn't award him a triumph. They refused that. They didn't even entertain that, thinking that Octavian would just kind of go away, I guess. And they awarded the victory instead to Decimus Brutus, who had been one of the conspirators in the assassination, one of the assassins, who had sat behind fortified walls in Gaul and done nothing while Octavian fought against Antony. Well, they awarded him the laurels as the victorious commander instead, and they commanded the legions to be transferred to Decimus Brutus. They even gave awards to Sextus Pompeius, the son of Pompey, who was currently sort of waging a rebellion against Rome in Spain and in Sicily. They gave him a military rank and tried to win him back into the ranks of the Senate, right? And this is what drove Octavian into the arms of Antony. Lepidus, who had also been sidelined, joined Antony in the north, and Octavian went up and had a meeting with the two of them where they agreed to share power. And then Octavian marched his soldiers down. None of them defected from him. In fact, there were several legions who had been loyal to Caesar who defected from Decimus Brutus and from Sextus Pompeius and the senators to Octavian. And he took control of the city. Brutus and Cassius at this point fled to the east. And they were already making plans to do that, but they left Italy. They were outside of Rome at that point, but they left Italy, went off to the east. And actually, now that the Senate was controlled by Octavian and Antony and Lepidus, they went nuts. They forced the Senate to authorize their partnership. This was known as the Triumvirate. The Second Triumvirate, as it's called, was actually an organ of the Roman government. Unlike the First Triumvirate, which was just kind of this partnership, this handshake agreement between the three men involved, this one was an actual organ of government. The three of them were given imperium, essentially consular authority to divide up all of the provinces of Rome, and the sort of special dispensation to see that nothing bad befall the state and all of that. They reduced the command, or rather the proconsular authority of Brutus and Cassius, and they eventually got them to, got the Senate to denounce them and to declare that they were enemies of the state. They divided up initially the western provinces among the three of them. Antony got Gaul, Octavian was given parts of Italy, Lepidus was given Africa. Anyway, there was a division of the western provinces between the three of them. And then, as I said, they went nuts. They carried out proscriptions against the senators and many of the equites who had opposed them. Most notably among the victims of this was Cicero. Why was Cicero killed? Well, mostly because he had spoken out against Antony and frankly hated Antony. Antony saw him as the greatest threat because of his ability to speak and win people over. There are all sorts of stories told about that. It was a mercenary in the pay, or rather a commander in the pay of Antony, who tracked down Cicero and had him killed. And they cut off his head and his hands and took them to Antony. And according to the sources we have, Antony's mistress grabbed Cicero's head, pulled his tongue out, and stabbed a hat pin through it, and then said something like, "Thus passes the offending member," right? It was the tongue, it was his ability to speak that was most feared. But now Cicero's dead, and his head and his hands were displayed in public in Rome for some time. And eventually these proscriptions ended up claiming the lives of about 300 senators and a couple thousand equites, and their property fell into the hands of these three. They forced the Senate to deify Caesar, to proclaim that he was a god. They set up altars in celebration of Caesar, and then they left Lepidus in charge in Italy, and Octavian and Antony went off to Greece, and Cassius and Brutus had assembled an army, probably of about 100,000 troops there, mostly drawn from the client kingdoms of Rome that had been friendly to Pompey. But there were a lot of, some of Pompey's troops were still over there. I mean, it was a kind of ragtag bunch, but it was still a formidable force. In a series of two battles, the forces of Octavian lost a battle to Brutus. Octavian was actually ill and wasn't present at the battle, but was blamed for the loss. Antony defeated Cassius. Cassius committed suicide, and then in a second battle, Antony joined forces with Octavian's forces and defeated Brutus, and Brutus also committed suicide. I should say that in the East, Brutus and Cassius had employed brutal means to try to build resources to oppose this eventuality. They had extracted just ungodly amounts of money from the provincials there. This had really made people frustrated with Roman rule. Brutus, who claimed all of these sort of high principles, was really quite rapacious in this regard. He did really terrible things there, killing off massive numbers of people who opposed his taxation schemes that had just, as I said, ungodly interest rates and things like this, right? So it's not surprising that Brutus was not popular, and this is actually going to complicate Antony's life eventually. So after this victory, the three of them then victoriously divided up the empire. The Senate is now completely in their hands. The Triumvirate is fully in control. But when they returned from Greece, they effectively marginalized Lepidus. They sent him off to Africa and said, that's all you get. And Lepidus was in no position. He did not have anywhere close to the backing that either of the other two had. So Lepidus ended up in North Africa with very little power to speak of. And then Antony was given rule over the eastern provinces and Octavian over the western provinces. Octavian was tasked with trying to deal with Sextus Pompeius, who was still operating from a base in Spain, but had seized control of Sicily. And this would be a thorn in the side of Octavian. Initially, fortunes really turn for the better for Antony in the short term, and for the worse for Octavian. Antony takes off to the east with the intent of raising a massive army and going on campaign against the Parthians, which would, in his mind, this is exactly, he is assuming the mantle of Caesar, who had planned to do this himself. This was supposed to be his chance to win everlasting fame and glory and establish himself as the greatest of Romans, and probably establish an autocracy with his control, right? That's kind of his plan. When Antony left, Octavian ended up seizing large amounts of land in Italy to settle his veterans on. This was unpopular. This led to riots in Rome and in other cities in Italy. The people who were not the beneficiaries of these land seizures, who had their lands actually seized from them, rioted. And the Antony's allies in Rome then tried to foment rebellion against Octavian to try to undercut his authority there. Antony's wife Fulvia, in particular, was responsible for this, though his brother Livius Antonius was also involved. Octavian managed to seize the moment, and this, he put down the riots. Both Fulvia and Livius Antonius were spared, but they went off to join Antony in the east, and both of them ended up dying soon after. Antony had made overtures to Sextus Pompeius to try to make he sort of did this in secret to try to undercut Octavian, right? They're both doing things to counter the power of the other one. To try to mitigate that, Octavian ended up marrying a relative of Pompey, to neutralize the threat of Sextus Pompeius, because he would not move against a close relative. This is Scribonia. Scribonia, even though this marriage was very short and unhappy, Scribonia ended up as the mother of Octavian's only child who survived into adulthood. This was Julia, his daughter. Of course, after Julius, right, the clan name that he now took on because he was Caesar's adopted son. In truth, one of Octavian's most important decisions, or rather one of his strategies, was to rely on very capable individuals. In domestic affairs, in kind of, public rhetoric and things like this, his chief advisor was was actually an Etruscan named Maecenas. And Maecenas was a brilliant mind. He was really good at manipulating public opinion. He was great at diplomacy. He actually managed to convince Antony a little bit after this to loan Octavian a bunch of ships to fight against Sextus Pompeius. I mean, he was good at this sort of thing. And then the other one was a man of rather humble origins, a plebeian named Agrippa. And Agrippa would become his closest military advisor. And Agrippa was brilliant in his military strategies, and he would become Octavian's most important advisor for the next several decades, actually, and eventually was adopted by Octavian as his heir and married to Julia, and that was, anyway, one of, we'll talk about that later. So, Octavian's reliance on these other individuals was important for him because Octavian was not a very impressive figure. He had been rather sickly as a young man. Even the statues of him, if we go back to the previous slide, you can see the statue of Octavian. He does not look that impressive, right? I mean, the one at the top is Antony, and, he has this imposing head of curly hair and this, strong, square jaw and all of that. Well, Octavian was like a 98-pound weakling, right? Seems to have had bad skin, bad teeth, just unimpressive in his physical appearance. And so having these great advisors, and Octavian was a shrewd political operator, a genius at manipulating public opinion through propaganda and things like this. Some of this was due to the advice that people like Maecenas gave him. But he's an imposing opponent here. And so these moves to counter Antony in the West eventually made Octavian an almost unchallenged authority in places like Italy. And even though Antony had still controlled places like Gaul, they had a meeting. They almost came to blows at this point. But they had a meeting to kind of smooth things over, and through intermediaries, Maecenas on Octavian's side, they reached an agreement that they would. They ignored Lepidus entirely. He wasn't even involved in this meeting at all. But Octavian would receive rule over the entire West, with the exception of Africa, where Lepidus was, and Octavian would have rule over the entire East, right? And to ensure that this partnership would work, Antony ended up marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia, and this was pretty common, as we've seen. Pompey married Julius Caesar's daughter and things like that, and Caesar actually had offered to marry Pompey's daughter. That ended up not happening. So this is supposed to create a kind of new status quo where we have the empire divided roughly in half between these two, right? Now, in the meantime, Octavian ended up divorcing Scribonia shortly after Julia was born, and he got married to a woman named Livia, who had been married to one of his advisors, a guy named Tiberius Claudius Nero. Remember those three names, by the way, because the Julio-Claudian dynasty had emperors named Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. Three different guys, right? All with names of the husband, I should say the ex-husband of Octavian's longtime wife, Livia. Livia was only 19 years old, but she caught the eye of Octavian. He fell in love with her, and he convinced Tiberius to, Claudius is the name he went by, to divorce her, and he showered favors on him, and she married Octavian. And she brought 2 sons into this marriage, and of course Octavian brought his daughter Julia, and they ended up not liking their stepchildren very much. But this ended up being a very successful marriage of about 50 years, as we'll talk about. More importantly, Antony had fallen in love with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra VII. How that happened is the stuff of legends, probably mostly legendary material, not based in actual, viable historical sources. The 2 of them met first around the year 42 or maybe 41 in Tarsus in Asia Minor, where they, were part of a kind of political gathering there to talk about Roman activity in the East, and Cleopatra was trying to ensure the stability of her own kingdom in Egypt, and Cleopatra ended up seducing Antony. How was this woman able to seduce both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? Well, it was long thought that she was just this stunning beauty. She was, of course, played by Elizabeth Taylor in the famous movie in 1962, 63, something like that. Elizabeth Taylor, who was, considered one of the great beauties in sort of the golden age of Hollywood. But evidence shows that she actually wasn't a particularly striking woman in terms of her physical beauty, but she was intensely charismatic, it seems, and a kind of enchanting figure who knew how to, manipulate men really, really well, and was also a shrewd political operator. And so around the same time that Antony married Octavia, he entered into this long-term affair with Cleopatra. He fathered 3 children with her, a set of twins, and then another son later on. And he began spending more and more time in Egypt, in Alexandria. And some of this was probably a political calculation that if he ingratiated himself with Cleopatra, that she would provide resources that he needed to try to conduct this campaign against Parthia. He did so in the early 30s, but was unsuccessful, and in fact had to escape the battlefield at one point after his troops were routed, and through Armenia, and then he went back to Alexandria and took up near permanent residence there, and never really tried much to go off to the east again. Some of this is probably due to the fact that Cleopatra seems to have cut him off from any funding at that point, and having lost a lot of his troops, he didn't dare do this. But from another perspective, we might say that he was so enamored of Cleopatra that he didn't care so much about his military responsibilities. There's 2 ways to look at this. In the meantime, Octavian, who had been initially unsuccessful against Sextus Pompeius, managed to finally defeat him and oust him from Sicily and kill Pompeius, actually. This was all due to the great military maneuvers of Agrippa, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the guy we talked about. And at this point, Octavian was really sitting pretty. So much so that he started to get more and more bold. When Sextus Pompeius was defeated, Lepidus made a kind of final play for to become a part of this story. He sent troops up to Sicily to try to seize control of that island. But when Octavian sent his forces down there, most of Lepidus's legions then defected to Octavian, and Octavian, captured his troops and ended up capturing Lepidus. And Octavian was so unworried about Lepidus that he didn't even have him put to death. He took away all of his titles. He let him keep the position of Pontifex Maximus, which he actually would control for many more years. For the next several decades, he was around while Octavian was ruling. But Lepidus was reduced entirely, and now Octavian had control of Africa and everything that Lepidus had once had. And Octavian started to grow in popularity after winning these victories over Sextus Pompeius, and then proceeding to invade Illyria, which was technically territory of Antony. and winning some military victories there. Octavian was awarded some triumphs and even given the title Imperator, which is translated as emperor, but it didn't really mean that. This was a kind of military honorific at this point. He also, like Julius Caesar, used things like public works to give people jobs and to provide entertainment and to do all these things to ingratiate himself with the Roman public. And he started to use propaganda effectively against Antony, where he would sort of hold up his sister as an example of a good Roman matron who was, doing her duty, and her husband is off, cavorting with this Egyptian queen who he hinted was using witchcraft to enthrall Antony and keep him in submission. And at one point, Octavian grew so bold as to invade the city hearth controlled by the Vestal Virgins, to seize control of Antony's will and to then proclaim what it said. And this was almost certainly a carefully edited account, but it seemed that Antony was trying to legitimize, first of all, Caesarion, who was the son of Julius Caesar by Cleopatra, which would have meant, if he was legitimate, that Octavian was not the true heir of Julius Caesar. And that seems to have been a calculation on Antony's part to do that. And moreover, the will left a lot of Roman territory to Cleopatra, and especially to his children by Cleopatra, who were being raised in Alexandria. Well, Octavian pushed that even further to say that Antony was trying to capture the entire republic and turn it over to Cleopatra to rule, that he was going to move the capital to Alexandria, and he made Antony look like a great enemy of the republic, right? A lot of that almost certainly was disingenuous, but Antony was really not careful with what he was doing and opened this up to Octavian. Well, long story short, in the year 32, the consuls were supporters of Antony, and many of the senators were as well. They saw through what Octavian was trying to do here, but when they tried to strip Octavian of some of his authority, the triumvirate had actually expired. Octavian had his tribunes who were supporting him veto that. And then he marched his troops into the Senate, seized control of it, dismissed the entire government, dissolved it, I should say, and then most of the senators and other supporters of Antony fled to the east, and this then precipitated the ultimate conflict, which came to blows in Greece at a place called Actium. This was mostly a naval battle, and Antony, on paper, actually had more troops and in some ways a better position, but the longer he waited, the more his troops were getting restless. Some of them even defected to Octavian. During the battle, Cleopatra, it seems, got frightened and took off in a very swift boat, left the scene of the battle. Antony, fearing that he was going to lose Cleopatra, then chased after her, and when he evacuated from the scene, most of the rest of the troops simply gave up and turned themselves over to Octavian. Both Antony and Cleopatra went back to Egypt. Octavian, once he had kind of stabilized things, went to Egypt, but Antony and Cleopatra ended up committing suicide in the year 30. Octavian then seized Egypt, which would be key to his control of Rome henceforth. Importantly, and I'll bring this point up in the next lecture, when he seized Egypt, he did not turn it over to Rome. He did not declare that this was going to be public land, that this was going to be property of the Republic. He seized it of his own accord and declared that this was his possession. And control of Egypt is absolutely vital to what Octavian ends up doing with the Republic, as we'll see. All right. I know that was a lot. I know that this has been a dizzying sequence of events that we've covered over the last few lectures in talking about